Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor Podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and Just Work. And a brief anecdote. I almost said I'm Kim Malone.
Interesting. Well, I'm Jason Rosoff.
Always have been.
CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor Podcast. And as we continue into 2022, or what we could all call the third year of 2020, we just keep pressing repeat, the mere idea of trying to get stuff done at work may in fact feel overwhelming. The good news is we can help with that. Well, we're at least going to try to help with that. And on this episode of the podcast, we're going to talk about the Get Stuff Done Wheel. By the way, Kim, formerly Kim Malone, currently Kim Malone, are you still calling it the Get Stuff Done Wheel?
Well, since we're on this podcast, I would prefer to call it the Get Shit Done Wheel, if that's okay.
That is, we can make that as an agreement. Okay, so the Get Shit Done Wheel, a step-by-step process that can help make getting things accomplished much easier. The Get Shit Done Wheel, or even GSD Wheel, has 7 steps. Listen, clarify, debate, decide, persuade, execute, and learn. Those are the 7 steps. We'll be digging into each of them. And when run effectively, the GSD Wheel will enable your team to achieve more collectively. Kim, I'm going to say they can achieve more collectively than anyone could ever dream of achieving individually. Are we going out on a ledge there? Are we dreaming of things individually, but we can actually get more done? Tell me everything.
I think that's better. I think it was a good fix. Thank you for the grammar. Thank you for the edit.
So let's go back in time, sort of low before 2020. Can you remember when you actually came up with this model and what inspired you to, if not create it, to put it down on page?
Yes. As with almost all things, it all began with a painful story that happened shortly after I joined Google. It's amazing I survived. So I was managing a team, and there were 5 people reporting to me, and they were great people. And after I had been at Google for about a month, I would say 3 of the 5 people left my team in the same week. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to get fired. I remember I drove out to the coast and just watched the waves rolling in, thinking, how am I going to handle this? And I went into my boss's office and I said, I'm sorry that my team has abandoned me. I must be a terrible person. What have I done wrong? Help me out here. And she said, you know what it is, Kim? You did the right thing at a practical level. You did what most people in your situation would do. So I had arrived at Google. I had this team. There were about 100 people, and it was like a gigantic children's soccer game. Everybody chasing the ball. It was chaos. And so I broke the team down into 5 sub-teams. Each team had a leader. Each team was responsible for one part of the customer life cycle. I thought it made a lot of sense. And my boss thought it made a lot of sense. But she said, the problem is you move too fast. She said, imagine that you are spinning a rope around your head. And from your perspective, all you're doing is just flicking your wrist. You're not making any violent moves. But if you're hanging on at the end of that rope, it's scary. You know, you're spinning people off your team with centripetal force. She explained to me that what I needed to do was to start by listening. And then she kind of walked me through this. And so that was sort of part of where this Get Stuff Done Wheel, Get Shit Done Wheel came from. It also, I borrowed a little bit of thinking from the military. There's something called an OODA loop. And it was sort of about how pilots processed information very quickly and changed what they did depending on what the enemy was doing. So that's the Get Stuff Done Wheel in a nutshell.
Awesome. And just for those, since we're listening, there was some gesticulating of the rope and being at the end of the rope, which I can imagine felt painful on the other side. Jason, Kim talked about listening being the first step in the Get Shit Done Wheel. Where does listening fall for you? First of all, do you agree with that? And second of all, how would you define what listening looks like, feels like, lands like for folks on a team?
Yeah, I think the reason why it's so important to put listen first is that a lot of people walk into the role of leader/manager and say, I need to direct. Job number one is to direct the actions of all the people who are on my team. And I think that there's sort of like a whole mythology, like this is how we see leaders when they are like represented in fictional stories, right? They're constantly directing. It'd be very boring to watch a movie.
Right, like you're not watching like General Patton just like with an ear, like just sort of standing at the battlefield. Listening.
Like a bunch of people saying, well, what do you think is not does not make a good movie.
It's a good New Yorker cartoon though.
But I actually think it's so important. And early in my career, I had the opportunity to work for another writer, Joel, who built an entire company around the idea that engineers were not listened to in organizations. Like it's hard to imagine now, but there was a period of time in which engineers were sort of treated like accountants. They were treated like fancy typists.
God, are you angering the accountants now? Can we make a clarification?
I also feel like accountants are unjustly treated. That's my point. You should be treating your accountant better.
All work should be respected.
Respected and honored. Absolutely. He built an entire company around the idea of listening, because basically what he said is like, the further away I get from the actual work that is being done, the less likely it is that I'm going to have an idea that will make a huge difference in this business. Like the closer people are to the customer, so like my customer service people, the closer people are to the actual engineering, the more likely that it is they're going to come up with an idea that could save the company tons of money or make the company tons of money. And I'll give an example of that from Radical Candor, which is we send this automated email response, and it's very helpful for like giving people some information. And at one point, Nora, who's our head of operations, who just had a baby. Congratulations, Nora, and baby Gavin.
Yay, Nora.
I missed that. Yay, Nora.
She said,
news.
Yes, fast breaking news indeed. On a podcast, which you'll hear a month from now.
Radical Candor Podcast. We're making all sorts. Kim is now Kim Malone, and Nora has a baby. Has a baby.
Yeah. But she said, I often will just like check in with people a couple of weeks later and just see if like, do they have any other, did they get all the information they needed? And she said, often people will come back to me and say, oh, I'm so glad that you checked. I didn't see your original email. And so she's like, could we automate that? It's just like kind of a pain in the butt for me to like remember to do that all the time. And we did that. And I would guess that since we implemented that a couple of years ago, it's probably earned the company $500,000.
Wow. Nora. Get that baby a onesie.
Baby needs a new pair of shoes and deserves the new pair of shoes. Yes.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And for me, I was in a state of like, I was just asking like, what's working, what's not. Like, hey, just tell me like, what's a pain? What's a thorn in your side? And she's like, here's this thorn in my side, which turned out to be a very valuable problem to solve.
I love that story. Yeah, that is, I think we learned by listening. Awesome. And obviously we can do a lot more listening on listening. In fact, we do have a podcast episode on that we'll put in the show notes. But let's move on down or around. I guess we're moving through and around our GSD wheel. Clarify, Kim. Why is clarify the second step in the wheel?
So you've listened now to someone's idea. And as Johnny Ive, when he was the chief design officer at Apple, said, new ideas are so easily squished. Since what we're going to do after we listen is eventually debate, before you put a new idea into the rock tumbler of debate, and Jason will explain what that means in a second. But before you send a new idea there, or a person with a new idea into a debate, you want to help them clarify that idea. You want to help them nurture that idea so that it's a little bit more robust. It is so important not only to listen, but to help the people who work for you learn how to explain their ideas in a way that is relevant to the other person. And this is really tricky. When we used to teach this at Apple, we used the Challenger launch explosion, and the engineer who worked on the O-rings, which failed and caused the explosion, actually knew. He went home the night before the launch and he told his wife, we decided to kill 7 astronauts today. So he knew it was going to fail. And he was interviewed later, and he said, rubber doesn't work worth a damn at freezing temperatures. Everyone knows that. Well, it turned out that everyone didn't know that. And so what may be obvious to someone who works for you is not going to be obvious to others. And so you want to make sure that you're helping them understand how to not only get clear in their own mind, the idea, but how to explain it to others. So that's kind of my 2 cents about why it's so important to clarify an idea before you go on to the next step.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when we think about the overall care personally, challenge directly of radical candor. We often will say another way to think about challenge directly is getting more and more clear. And that's the challenge. And as a manager, as a coach, helping the folks you work with get more clarity about what their ideas are. I know that's one of the things I love about Jason as my manager. First of all, he is the opposite of squishing my ideas, but really, asking the kinds of questions that help me get more clarity in my head. And I see this a lot, even when people practice giving feedback, you're trying to say 5 things at once. And so there's a real process. And what are you actually trying to say and really breaking it down? So I know, Jason, you're going to get into debate, but is there anything more as people think about clarifying? I think this is one of your many skills, but really, you have such a way of breaking things down into smaller parts. Do you have any quick tips for folks on clarifying before you move into the rock tumbler?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add to that, because I think all what you've has already been added is great, is that it's easy to assume you know what another person means. And the value of treating clarify as a step in my mind is to make explicit the assumptions. When you say this, this is what I hear you say, right? Everybody knows that rubber isn't worth a damn at freezing temperatures. I could say I was not aware of that, right? It's important. It's important that I didn't know that was true. And so treating it as a step that we take where we make explicit the assumptions that we make based on what we hear is really valuable to someone who's going to then go into a conversation where they're trying to explain that idea to other people, because they can say, oh, well, if Jason didn't know, there's a chance that other people didn't know. So maybe I should try to clarify that and say, here's where, let me tell you a little bit about the materials that we use, how they work, and why I think it's a good idea for us to choose something other than rubber.
Or not launch, since I had already...
Or not launch in this case. Yeah. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I feel like that we could go down that tangent and try to look into, why people didn't bring that up and what was that process. I'm sure there's a lot of business school case studies on that.
There's a great book called The Challenger Launch Decision. Basically, he gave a bunch of charts and graphs and nobody understood the charts and graphs. Whereas if he had just said, rubber doesn't work worth a damn at freezing temperatures, which interestingly, he said later to the documentarian. So who was taking the time to try to clarify, how did this happen? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's one of the other tactics is the pre-mortem, right? That can help you clarify.
That's a great point. So we've done our pre-mortem, we've listened, we've clarified, we're moving into, Kim has foreshadowed the rock tumbler of debate, Jason.
There are a couple of things about debate that I think people get wrong. One of them is they don't treat it as a game with rules. It's actually really important to go into a debate with a clear sense of we're creating a space for a very specific thing to happen, which is at the end of this process, what we want for the idea to be better than when it started. Whatever it is that we're talking about, we want the idea to be better than when we started. I'm not debating Kim's value. We're debating the merit or the sort of value or the essence of the idea that's being presented. And the metaphor of the rock tumbler, I think, is so helpful because it is a very apt simile, maybe, or we haven't decided simile or metaphor for debate meetings. So if you Google rock tumbler Steve Jobs, you'll be able to find an example of him saying something to the effect of a great debate meeting is like a rock tumbler. You put ideas along with some grit, right? Some actual friction, some sand together, and you turn it over and over and over again. And what you get at the end, you start with these very sort of sharp, lumpy things. At the end, you get a smooth, polished idea. And what's important to me about that is to recognize that often people feel like something has gone wrong in a debate if there's friction, but like it's the opposite is true. Like it's good for there to be friction in debate. That's why it's so important to like define this container and say, here are the rules. We actually want there to be some friction. We want to disagree with each other. Now's the time to do that, because as we move around this wheel, it's going to get harder and harder to stop this train. So now's like a good time for us to actually get into that.
I think also I like what you said, Jason, about sort of make it a game, but it's also important to remember that people don't win or lose a debate. All the people in the debate are on the same side, and they have the same goal, which is to come up with the best idea. And so there may be a little noise, a little friction, but it's really useful to realize that we're all on the same side. We all have the same goal, which is to come up with the right idea for the team. That is really crucial. And the more you can check your ego at the door, another tip on having a great debate is bring data, not recommendations, because we tend to attach our egos to recommendations in a way that we don't necessarily attach our egos to data, hopefully. Well, sometimes.
You know, often I'll get a question in a workshop around, we talk about criticizing privately, right, in a one-to-one manner. And so how do you distinguish, in your own words, between that one-to-one criticism versus the kind of criticism that might happen in a debate conversation?
Yeah, debate obviously needs to happen publicly. And I think there's a big difference between debating an idea and criticizing a person. But it's kind of hard to define exactly where that difference is. But to me, if you're saying there's a typo on page 6, I think that's fair game to say publicly. Whereas you always make typos is something you need to say in private. What do you think?
I'll add that, at least in my mind, when I've thought about this wheel, or like implemented my own version of it, at the stage of debate, I want people to come in with questions, not answers, right? So when you say bring data, not recommendations, that's how I see it. So like ideally, you're starting this debate with what if, and then this, like, what if this possibility existed? And you're like, oh, what if that? Well, I can build on that. Like, what if we did this? Or what if we changed that a little? You know what I'm saying? So like that question of like, what if, building on each other. Kim, at one point you actually, I think you might have been even on the podcast, but you talked about the difference between sort of like academic debate and Rogerian debate, right? Where you're like, academic debates are where there's winners and losers. Like we're taking opposite positions versus what a process we're describing, which is we are collectively contributing. We are tumbling this idea collectively, and it should feel generative. Like now it's not, I don't think it's totally possible, because especially when people care a lot about the work, they're going to become attached to their idea. So even if they come in the like absolute right mindset, it can be kind of tough for people to do that, which is why it's so important that if you do see something that you feel like, hey, that's not fair game for this conversation, right? Like just because Kim might always do that, like that's not what we're here for today. What we're here for today is like to work on this idea. So if you want to contribute, I'm going to encourage you to contribute something to the idea. Like how can we make that better? What can we do differently, to address your concern in the idea? So it's important that there's some kind of, I want to say moderator for debate also. Yeah,
a moderator and a mindset for the debate. I think that the idea of a Rogerian discussion is that the goal is to understand one another's position, and you take on the other person's position at some point. You kind of rotate through. You argue the other side. Jason, you were giving me this advice just yesterday, where I was having what seemed like an intractable argument with someone, and you said, "Why don't you switch roles?" I was like, damn, that's my advice. Why are you giving it to me?
You switch roles. He was doing it for you.
Yes, we switched roles. And you were right. That was actually very helpful. So the idea, there was a period of time at Apple where there was a huge debate about whether or not to launch iTunes on the Windows platform. And this was kind of a make the company decision. And Steve Jobs was vehemently opposed to that idea. He thought that the whole idea of iPod and iTunes was to persuade people to switch to Macs. And Macs at that point, I think, had like 2 or 3% market share. The iPod team very much wanted to be able to sell to people who didn't have Macs, since that was the vast majority of people. They were pushing for this. And Steve at some point realized that he was wearing that team down, that the rock tumbler was going to turn everyone into dust. And so he said, why don't we switch sides, and I'll argue for your side and you all argue not to. And that was very helpful to keeping the debate going long enough that they could get to the best answer without grinding each other down to dust.
I love that story. And I'm curious, we're going to move on to Decide in just a moment. But as you think about the wheel, Kim, in your experience, are there points along the way that sort of are the most likely to mess up an organization if they miss one? Or are they kind of equally important?
I would say they're all equal. That's why it's a perfect circle. They're all equally important. It took me a long time to draw it that way, too. The goal here, I think that there is a tax to collaboration. This is why working with other people and not alone is a little bit tiring, because there is a little bit of a sometimes there's a big collaboration tax. And the goal when you're the leader is to make sure you're not skipping any steps, make sure everybody's paying their fair share of tax to collaborate, but minimizing the tax, making sure everybody's paying as little as possible. So you want to keep it moving. I think skipping a step is dangerous. Getting stuck in debate is dangerous. So let's move on.
You end up with a team of dust. Kim, when it comes to deciding, you've written that the best bosses often don't decide themselves, but it's really about creating a clear decision-making process, empowering people closest to the facts or the data, perhaps, to make as many decisions as possible. So tell us a little bit more about how you came to that approach for decision-making, which may have been unusual at the time in terms of management philosophy.
It is very tempting to think when you become the boss that you are the decider. I think we had a president who made that mistake. I'm the decider. You're not the decider when you are the manager. Your job is to push decisions into the facts. Your job is to build your team's decision-making muscle. There's a wonderful book that James March wrote called A Primer on Decision-Making. And he explains that people, when they are stripped of decision-making authority, when they don't get to contribute to a decision that is relevant to them, it feels like a loss of personhood. People get extremely emotionally upset, understandably, when they are excluded from decisions. And so the last thing you want to do as a leader is to grab decisions, especially decisions where you don't have the facts. But you're because you have a little bit of power when you become a manager, you can do that. And a lot of managers make the mistake of doing that. So you want to make sure that you remember that your job is to decide with your team, not alone, what are the most important decisions that need to get made that week? Who are the deciders? And when does the decision need to get made? And I used to like to do that in my staff meeting. We would decide what the decisions were, and then we would make those decisions in a separate big decisions meeting. And ideally, neither I nor anyone who reported directly to me was the directly responsible individual for those decisions. Other people were the deciders. We were not the deciders. And that was really helpful, because I think there comes a time as you grow when your staff, at least there came a time for me, when my staff meeting, everyone who was in it hated it and thought it was too long and dragging on forever. And everyone who was not there felt sad and bad and left out. And it was like, it was a disaster. And the kind of big decisions meeting really helped us break through that.
Awesome. Well, we don't want people feeling sad, bad, and left out. So it's time to move on the wheel to persuade them about these decisions that folks have just made. Jason, persuasion, tell us everything. Persuade us about persuasion.
I want to say that in some sort of like decision-making frameworks, I think they use the wrong word here. They use the word inform.
Not very persuasive.
Yeah. And so like, and the reason why I think this is different, once the decision has been made, it's important to be able to articulate not only what the decision is, but why that decision was made. It's important to be able to try to align people behind the sort of facts of the decision, but also the intent of the decision. And it's like, it's hard to do. It feels like extra work because you've already, like you've been through the rock tumbler. So you're at this point, you're feeling like I've put in so much effort. Surely everybody must understand the decision at this point, must understand the decision that has been made. Why should I have to go out and now further persuade them? To Kim's point, I think expecting someone to execute work, especially creative work, that they don't understand exactly what the decision is or why it's been made, is setting you up for sadness of like people feeling very emotionally upset or some combination of sad, mad, and left out. And so taking the time to persuade, I think, also shows respect, right? Like if I'm saying, look, I understand that even though this decision has been made, like I need to make a compelling argument to you about why we've made this decision, why we're going this direction. And the last thing that I'll add here is like, there's another value in doing this, and especially in communicating not only the what, but the why we are doing this, which is inevitably your decisions are going to be wrong. And so the more information people have about how you arrived at the decision and why you arrived at it, the faster you will start to learn information about what could be better about that decision. And so without the step of persuasion, without like actually putting effort into communicating this clearly, I think you lose the valuable network of brain power that you have in the team of people who will be executing.
Absolutely. I think there's also something that I find helpful when it comes to persuasion, which is to think about it in terms of Aristotle's rhetoric. So Aristotle said there's three elements to persuading someone. There's your own credibility. How do you establish that you have the right to make this decision and that people should listen to you? There's the logic, which you just talked a lot about, Jason, but there's also the emotion. A big part of being persuasive is understanding and taking into account the emotions of the other people and the way that you communicate. So, for example, if I can use another Apple example, I got Apple on the mind today. Another Apple example, when Apple decided to do a partnership with Microsoft, Steve Jobs announced it by saying, "Hell froze over." And this was persuasive because what he was doing was he was addressing the emotions of the Mac faithful. This was when after they decided to launch iTunes on the Windows platform, they had to announce this decision and this partnership with Microsoft. For a lot of people, that felt like a betrayal. And if Steve Jobs had stood up and said, the reason we did it is because we only have 3% market share, that would have not addressed the emotions in the room. But by saying, hell, I said we would only do this when hell froze over. Well, hell has frozen over. It'll only happen once in a lifetime. That was a way to explain the decision, to persuade others that he felt their emotions and was willing to address them.
Yep.
I'm so glad you brought in emotions. One thing that was on my mind before we move on to executing when it comes to persuading and the previous steps, we've gotten a bunch of questions over the past year or two for Radical Candor keynotes, workshops around, decisions that have been made, especially around return to work, especially around hybrid, especially around, we were returned to work and now we're not, and when are we going back and who's going in? And so it just feels like if we've missed any of the steps along the wheel, there's not going to be as much buy-in. And so especially that emotional part, it seems so important. So as I bring that up before we move on to executing, anything, Jason or Kim, that you feel like is even more important now in the environment that we're in?
I wouldn't say more important, but I would just say that I feel like if you really look into a lot of the decisions that have return to office decisions that have been made and remote work versus hybrid work versus in-person work policy decisions that have been made, I guarantee you they didn't skip just one step of this process. I can guarantee you that they skipped several steps of this process, potentially all of the steps other than decide and execute.
Yeah, I think that totally agree.
Great. Well, just another reminder, we'll reinforce each step in its own equidistant place along the wheel. And so, Kim, back to you about executing, which when I look at that word, there is something sort of aggressive about
I have the
that.
same.
I'm looking at it. I'm like, it just looks very, very aggressive. So,
so podcast listeners, come up with a synonym for execute that is nonviolent. I got some feedback recently that I tend to use violent language, and it's something I've really been thinking about because I do consider myself a nonviolent person. So when I mean execute, I just mean doing stuff. But there's got to be somewhere between execute and doing stuff is the right word. So the thing is that I don't know about you all, but I have found at many points in my career that all my time at work is having meetings. And then when it comes time to do the work I need to actually do, I have to do that late at night when I should be sleeping. That is a recipe for burnout. And so one of the things that is really important, I think, as a manager is to make sure that you are not wasting a minute of your team's time, that you are really kind of being rigorous. See, I was going to say ruthless, but I said rigorous instead. That you're being rigorous about canceling unnecessary meetings, about not taking up people's time so that they do have time to do the work as well as to talk about doing the work. I think also it is important to encourage people to block out work time, to block out the individual time that you need, think time in your calendar so that your whole calendar doesn't get taken up with collaborative tasks, so that you do have time to do the work that you need to do as an individual. Those are a couple of thoughts on making sure that you are saving your own time and that you're encouraging your team to do their work at work and to go home and do what they want to do at home. I think another thing that is important about this is you want to, as a manager, Amy, you and I were emailing about this earlier, you want to, as a manager, make sure that you kind of are keeping a little bit of dirt underneath your fingernails. Like even when Joel on Software wrote about getting away from the code, he still could code. And I think it's really important as a leader that you spend some time actually doing the work alongside with your team, that you're not only directing the work, but that I used to, when I was at Google, I used to make sure that I was spending some time every week answering customer support emails, for example, because a lot of my team were spending all their time answering customer support emails. And if I couldn't understand the systems they used, if I didn't do the work myself, then I wasn't going to be a very good leader.
And just to, one clarification, Joel, was it Joel on Software, just to be clear on?
Yes, Joel on Software. Joel, what's his actual name?
Joel Spolsky.
I can never remember. Joel,
okay, well.
One of my husband's heroes, Joel, so shout out to you.
Okay, wonderful. We'll put that in the show notes. And then just the exception that breaks the rule of the dirt under your fingernails is when it comes to diamond cutting, as we learned in a recent podcast episode. We don't want that sort of dirt under your fingernails.
No, but he was mostly negotiating the prices, which he did himself.
Okay, great. All right, so the last step to bring it home, Jason, on the wheel is one of our favorite things, learning. Take it away.
Yes. So I in some ways, similar to persuade and clarify, having learn be an explicit step, because to some extent, at every step you want to be clarifying, at every step you want to be persuading, right? At every step you want to be learning. But to say we're explicitly going to take time to learn, I think is extraordinarily helpful for a lot of people, because it's really easy for one of two things to happen at the end of a decision. One is like, it goes really, really well. And like the thing takes off and you sort of forget how you got there. I've had this happen so many times in my career. It's like projects that are runaway successes, you probably missing major learnings that could change what you do in your organization by not slowing down to say, like, what did we actually learn from making the decision the way that we did? What did we learn from executing the decision the way that we did? And the reverse is also true. It's like sometimes a project isn't going well and we're so attached We like wanted it to work so badly that we're afraid to look closely at what went wrong. And we don't learn from that either. And so we wind up making the same mistakes or failing to repeat our successes because we're not dedicating time specifically to learning. And at Khan Academy in a previous life, we used the blameless retrospective structure, which is internet well documented, like how to structure a blameless retrospective. But similar to the spirit of the debate, the whole idea was like, this is not about blame, right? The goal here is to like share data, to share observations, and to try to be as clear as possible so that we can learn as much as possible. One thing that was really interesting is like when I was running these meetings, I often had to like very explicitly say what went well, because I feel like very smart's the wrong word, but like people who are invested in their work and who want to do really well, who are motivated to do really well, are often like very harsh critics. And so we would spend the entire time criticizing a thing, and I'd be like, hey, we signed up 20 million users. Like, that's pretty good, right? Like,
something actually worked really well here.
So like, there's probably something to talk about there, even though like that we should have used a different bug tracker, and like this process didn't work, and this whole thing blew up. And I think when you get to this step, it's actually really important to make sure that you take a balanced approach. Even in an unsuccessful project, there are things that went well that you can learn from, that you could repeat in another project in the future.
That's awesome. And Jason, I know Kim had mentioned about a pre-mortem. Where would you put the pre-mortem in the wheel? Where would you slot that?
The post-mortem is learn.
Right, the post-mortem is learn. So where are we doing? Yeah.
But I actually think it's sort of interesting as I think there's a couple of places it could fit, but the pre-mortem in my mind is really helpful before Persuade, because it helps you get into the mindset of like, why might people be really disappointed by this decision? Like, it forces you to fast forward and say, like, what's going to happen? Like, if this goes incredibly well, like, what's going to be happening in the company? How are we going to be feeling about it? What kind of new capability we're going to have? If this goes disastrously bad, who is the most affected by that? Is it clients? Is it an internal team? Like, and I need to persuade people. And of course, people are going to be worried about things going disastrously wrong, right? So like, if it has a high probability of affecting you, it's probably going to be very easy to focus on like, what if this goes wrong? And that's really helpful information to have before you go into trying to persuade people.
That's so interesting. So Kim, if you have this before the Persuade and you realize there's a high probability of it going off the rails, can you actually throw out the decision, or do you just stick with it because we all decided and we don't want to go back on the wheel?
I think it's fine to go backwards and forwards, but in general, I wouldn't change a decision because people will be sad about it.
Right.
If I thought it was the right decision, I would address the sadness. Same thing with feedback. Just because someone is sad doesn't mean that I should not tell them the thing, but I should take the time to address the emotions in the room. That's the point.
Yep.
And one thing we haven't mentioned, but before we get into our tips, how do you create an obligation to dissent? Like this idea, especially in a debate, that people are actually encouraged to disagree with each other.
Yeah, there are certainly cultures where debate is very uncomfortable and unlikely to happen. And in fact, there was one leader I worked with who moved from New York to Japan, and he was very frustrated. He couldn't get people to engage in debate. And he bought this big gavel, like a hammer that a judge has that bangs, where he bangs. And he had printed on it, obligation to dissent. And anytime there was silence, he would pass the gavel down to anyone, and say, you need to take the opposite point of view. It's if all of us agree, we're probably not looking at this topic hard enough. So I think, and I spent some time at McKinsey, and a big part of their culture, I mean, there could have been a little more dissension there, I guess, that given the problems they've had recently. I wish there had been more dissension on the Sackler team. Part of the culture that I really liked was obligation to dissent, and it was really respected. I remember at one point, I worked there for a summer, and it was very late, and we were working on a deck, and we were changing pie charts to bar charts and back again. And the partner on the deal said, "Kim, what do you think?" And, I'm a summer intern. I didn't really, I was honored that he asked, but I was tired and grouchy. And I said, "I think we're futzing. It doesn't matter whether it's a pie chart or a bar chart." And then as soon as it was out of my mouth, I was like, "Oh." And he looked at me and he said, "Thank you. You're right. We need to just put this to rest." And so that was, to me, like a good example of being encouraged to dissent.
An anti-pattern here is to tell people they'll regret it if they don't speak up now.
Yes.
I do think that sometimes the obligation...
Forever hold your peace.
Yes. I do think that every once in a while, I've seen this happen more than one time, both in organizations that I've been a part of and organizations where I'm coaching people, where they'll implement a process like this. And then they'll treat it as though it is sacrosanct, meaning we follow the steps exactly. And if you don't dissent at the appropriate times, then tough noogies, we're not going to listen to you later when you raise a problem. And that is a really great way to get people not to participate at all in the system at all. You know what I'm saying? Even though the idea is we've created a space for people to sort of have this debate. I think the obligation to dissent has to go outside of that. I do think there's a limit. There's a place at which you have to say okay, we've made this decision. We need to be committed to this. I need to know that you're not going to undermine this decision continuously forever. And at the same time, I think especially if you're a person with significant power or authority in an organization, if someone goes out of their way to dissent, even on an idea, it's worth listening. Even an idea you feel that's decided, it's worth listening to what they have to say. Kim, to your point, it's a very risky thing. It's scary to dissent, especially when you feel there's consensus. Everyone's agreeing, everyone's on board. It's worth listening to what they have. Doesn't mean you change the decision, but it's worth listening to what they have to say.
Isn't there a movie about this, The Minority Report? You want to make sure that you're listening to all the voices. The whole point of having a team is to listen to everyone and to make sure that people, not just to listen to them, but to make sure everyone's speaking up.
Now it's time for our Radical Candor checklist. These are tips you can use to start putting Radical Candor and the GSD Wheel right into practice immediately. So tip number 1, the GSD Wheel, just to remind you, Get Shit Done Wheel, it's designed to be cycled through quickly. Kim spent a lot of time getting those steps equidistant around the circle so that you would not skip a step, but you would also not get stuck on one step. These are equally important parts of the GSD wheel. If you do skip a step, you're going to end up wasting time in the end. And if you allow any part of the process to drag it out, working on your team is going to start to feel like paying a collaboration tax rather than making a collaboration investment.
Tip number 2, create an obligation to dissent. This process doesn't work if everyone just agrees with each other. And in fact, if that's your experience, it probably means that you're not looking closely enough at this issue.
And tip number 3, let's make sure you don't, as we said earlier, grind your team to dust. You want to make sure that, especially in debate, you pause for emotion and exhaustion. There are times when people are just too tired, too burnt out, or emotionally charged up to engage in a productive debate. It is really important to be aware of these moments because they rarely lead to good outcomes. Your job is to intervene and call a timeout when you notice emotional exhaustion, which I suspect we're all noticing. At least I'm feeling more emotionally exhausted more of the time these days. So if you don't pause for emotion and exhaustion, people will make a decision before they're ready to make a decision, just so they can go home. Or worse, they'll get into a huge fight and you'll have to spend a lot of time cleaning up the mess later.
Yeah, I can just, that pie chart fight could have really gone, there could have been pies being thrown, on the 54th floor in Midtown Manhattan.
Yes.
I'm glad it ended so well. All right. So for more tips, go ahead, visit radicalcandor.com/resources. We've got a bunch of learning guides to help you practice radical candor. You can see the show notes for this episode. And by the way, we've also got detailed blog posts. Thank you, producer Brandy Neal, for those blog posts about each step of the Get Shit Done Wheel, although I think we call it Get Stuff Done on the website. This is just between us. You can go to radicalcandor.com/podcast. Of course, if you like what you hear, go ahead, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Don't forget, Kim, there's still a book out there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it is.
Tell us what it's called.
Just Work: How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Create a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusion. It's available everywhere books are sold.
All right. Finally,
by the way, can I interrupt, Amy?
Please.
Sorry. If you don't like what you hear, we would be remiss not to solicit negative feedback as well. If you don't like what you hear, we want to hear about it. So
how do you want them to tell us, Kim?
Well, I'd rather you tell us directly than tell Apple Podcasts, but you can do it any way you're most comfortable.
There is an email address, radicalcandor@radicalcandor.com. Where we solicit this kind of feedback from our public events. So feel free to send it there.
Radicalcandor@radicalcandor.com. Again, we also had a plea out to you for a better word than execute, right?
Yes.
So we would love to hear from you on that. I don't know if Apple Podcast is interested in that either, but we certainly are. And finally, the Radical Candor store, all the swag your heart could dream of, onesies, etc. Radicalcandor.com. Click the shop link. And that's it for now. Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.